Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. I'm Kevin, your host and guide through the dumpster fire that is our political landscape. Today, I'm joined again by none other than Truman of Return to Reason, and today we do something a little bit different. We were blessed with a great opportunity by Thinkspot to do a live stream event on their platform and their podcast. And for those of you who don't know about Thinkspot, it's a social networking platform that provides a space for an interesting and authentic conversation on a wide range of topics. It was also launched with the help of this semi-interesting and famous guy named Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's also featured on a bunch of their Thinkspot Presents podcasts, so it's really exciting for us to be on there. During this event, we talked about the poor state of our institutions in America and whether or not they're worth saving or even fighting for, or if we should create alternatives and just let those institutions destroy themselves. We do all of this while reading comments and taking questions from the listeners, so it was a really fun time for both of us. But before we get into it, I want to remind you where you can find Truman. You can find him on Twitter at MyMundaneMind. You can find him on his YouTube channel by just searching Return to Reason. Make sure to subscribe. You can find a lot of his writing on Medium.com. You can also obviously find him on Thinkspot. And you can join his community and support him by going to returntoreason.locals.com. And now where to find me, you guys know to go already. Catch me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can look me up on YouTube by searching Engineering Politics and subscribing to my YouTube channel. You can find me on Thinkspot. You can find my written content on Medium. And to support this content and become a part of my growing community and find other exclusive content that you can't find anywhere else, like the new video series Another Round with Kevin, join my locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get to it. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.
Do you want to go ahead and kind of lay that groundwork you were talking to me about at the beginning before we, when you're talking like maybe an hour or two ago about how, because I think that was a really interesting point you made, that, probably most people watching this are familiar with us, but even if they are, I thought that you had a really interesting point of drawing basically a straight line from the ideas that we've talked about. And built an argument for something, and how, you made the point that this conversation about institutions and their failing, and what to do about that, is probably a very logical culmination of, 30 plus hours of our conversation. So why don't you go ahead and lay that out? Because I think that's a really interesting point, just for people, and maybe kind of give some of the bullet points of the other stuff that we've discussed that feeds into this particular conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, so, like we said, I think a lot of the 5 people watching us right now probably are familiar with our content, but we did build a massive foundation that is the 30 plus hours of streaming, not including, I would even include the election live stream, which was, 10, 15 hours in and of itself, which is a freaking nightmare. Probably never doing that again. Maybe we'll do that again, hopefully in a limited capacity.
I want to pull some clips from that, by the way, because there was some of the stuff in that I think is super relevant for stuff going on today. I just have to get the fortitude up to watch the whole damn thing.
For sure. I think it was great. And shout out to James and Commutation Construct for hopping in and talking with us too there to keep it alive. But other than that, I mean, we built a foundation of, it went from, I wouldn't say academic, but certainly non-tangible ideas into baby steps into more practical ideas and practical action. And that's really what we want to work towards. I mean, the YouTube and even, some of the bigger names, the Daily Wire type names, I mean, they're huge in being able to explain, what has happened so far, but they're not as good as giving you those actionable items, those practical ideas that help you make changes going forward.
But also isn't in their lives as much, so with those daily,
right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, when you're outside and you have, again, we use the example of Ben Shapiro. It's like, well, if the public education sucks, just pull your kids out and put them in a $100,000 a year guy. So, right. It's, I don't think he'd proclaim that exactly, but the point is, we laid the foundation of understanding. I mean, we started with, I think it was titled Government Jobs, and we kind of just played around with the ideas of what government ought to do. And we came from very different beginnings. Just something, if you haven't heard from us before, Truman, you come more of the left. I mean, you voted for Bernie Sanders. I'm someone who comes more from the right. I would be more of a Mitt Romney guy. And then coming, like, I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. And we kind of talked about that and how, my evolution and your political evolution have both changed to kind of, we're now aligned somewhat, in the same category here. But, we talked about what we think the government ought to do. Then we talked about, how we found this rigid hierarchy become erected and what we see today, and then kind of the intrusion into institutions that we're seeing today, right? We talked about the Overton window. We talked about all this different kind of intangible stuff, and now we're moving more toward the practical into, okay, now we're here. We understand how we got here. Now what do we do?
Yep.
Now this is the important question. And this is the title we're talking about right here is siege versus separation. What do you do with these institutions now that you understand how they got here? And this is the important question, something that people are not answering, either because it's too difficult for them to answer, or some of these people, this doesn't make sense for them to answer. It makes sense for this problem to keep growing because they can keep growing their audience and saying, oh, look how bad these guys are, instead of actually suggesting what we ought to do to fix the problem. Yep. And that's what, this is where we're at today.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really good observation that, really our discussion about the hierarchies was, so, hey, he's saying, try that embed link. You see that?
Yeah.
And then click go live on Thinkspot. So I'm gonna keep talking though. And sure. that hierarchies one for me is one that I think really informed a lot of the way I've conceptualized our current situation, especially as, I've discussed before, which is that I think I made this point in one of our Ember episodes, which was that the methods by which our institutions were captured by these activists, demagogues, authoritarian types, they're not available to us. They entered the institutions, and the institutions didn't realize that they were a hostile force. And so they took them on good faith, the principle of charity, all these other things. And so the point is that now that they've taken control of the institutions, they know that anything that isn't them is a hostile force, because it's all about theory. It's a binary. You're either with us or you're not. And so the point that I've made is, and I think a lot of those seeds were sown whenever we were talking about the corrupt hierarchies now a year ago, which is that we have to rethink what it would look like to even try and take them back, because we can't do it through the same methods, at least in a lot of these cases, through the same methods that, hey, thanks, Robert. He says we're live on Thinkspot.
We're here.
Great.
We're live.
So what he said is that we can't, or not what he said, sorry. My point is that we can't take them back by the same means. And so the example I gave is that's why I like the siege metaphor, which we can get into, but is they went in, they took the castle, but then they raised the drawbridge and posted archers on the wall. And so we can't get in the same way. Yes. Thank you to the team as well. Robert, thank you, Thinkspot team, for getting that taken care of.
Well, we just break here real quick. We're live on Thinkspot now. We're live on YouTube. So, whichever one you want to watch us on, but I just want to take a quick, shout out to Thinkspot for allowing us to go live here. Hopefully we'll be making that on the Thinkspot Presents podcast as well. So we'll be there. You've heard big names like Jordan Peterson. I'm pretty sure Vesper Stamper's been on there. We both really enjoy her. Giving us the opportunity to go live. Our alternative here was probably like OnlyFans. I think we could have linked up our accounts on there, but the expectations there, I think, are a bit different.
And every time we've done that before, we
never found that
successful as we thought it'd be.
That's the problem. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I did later. I don't really. We don't need to talk about it. But yeah, the point is we don't want to have to go back to that. But no, I totally agree. Yes. Thank you, Thinkspot, for doing this. Ideas live here, right? That's the motto. So hopefully we can live up to that with some ideas. So since Kevin, you've laid the groundwork for, a little bit of what has led us here. Why don't you tee us up in terms of like this specific conversation, why you think it's important, what you're thinking about going into it. And then we can kind of do it back and forth. And as it either, if it organically arises, we can engage some of those questions, or we'll get into them more on the back end. But we talked a lot at the beginning. Before going live, I've got some notes here that I'm really excited for this conversation. So I kind of want to hear your side of it, of what are you thinking? How are you conceptualizing this, problem with our institutions? And why don't you kick us off here, bud?
Yeah, and right before I begin, if you want to send your questions in, you can send them. There's a separate questions aside from the chat on Thinkspot. You can send them into. You can also send them in if you're watching on YouTube now. Send them in there. We'll make sure to get to them at some point throughout the show. But to start this out, I mean, like I said, we've been building up to this moment with these more intangible ideas, and now we're getting to the point. It's like, all right, we recognize where we're at. We see these institutions. We can get more into specific institutions later, but we see these, they're becoming a problem. I think they're making, they're affecting the culture, which is something we like to always talk about, that politics is downstream from culture, and we need to maintain a healthy culture if we want a healthy politics. And we're seeing the corruption in culture. I think we have a very, very sick culture right now. And you can see that manifest itself in these corrupt institutions that have been going too far. And now the question is, like, what do we do with those institutions? Like, how do we affect the culture in a way that's going to change those institutions from the inside? Can they?
And is it even possible?
And what, exactly. And we have a limited bandwidth to focus on something. And if we spread this bandwidth out across all of these different institutions, can we successfully change them all, or do we have to focus in on one or two and really get in there and try to change them, and then try to separate out from the other ones that we deem not as important for our culture or not as important for our politics? So we really have to be smart, not only in the strategy we take to affect an institution, but what do we focus on? What is our priority list? Because there has to be a priority, because even though I would say half the country is I would say more than half the country, if they kind of understood what was happening, would be in this battle with us. But, I don't know what percentage you'd say of the country kind of understands what's happening and is willing to push back. I think it's relatively low, but again, it's getting that information out there. Exactly. It's going to be small, but if you were to poll, I think a good litmus test, when we talked about on a recent podcast somewhere else, is kind of the Blues Clues video. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this, that they went full woke. They had the drag queen animated thing talking about transgender, like it's a kid's show. And the problem is, what got us to that point, and does it make sense to fight against it? And like I said during that conversation, if we were to poll every American who watched that and has kids, and they're able to anonymously answer and say, I think this is a good thing, or I think this is a bad thing for kids, I think most Americans, like I'm talking like 80-90% of Americans, would say this is stupid. Why would you ever do this for kids? But if you were to go the other route and say, you have to answer this not anonymously, you got to put your name on your vote, I think that percentage is way, way lower, because they're scared of the pushback that's going to come against it. So that's an kind of example of an institutional change that, I think people want to fight back against, but they're either not willing or not able to fight back against it. So we got to kind of figure out what strategy is best to fight which institution at that given time.
Yep. Yeah, we have to pick our battles. And anytime you have limited resources, limited time, energy, which I guess those are resources, limited numbers, you do have to pick them wisely. And that's one of the things, like the nitty gritty, the practicality of it is one of the things I'm excited to talk about. Because like I mentioned before we went live, not all institutions serve the same purpose. Some of them are load-bearing institutions in terms of what keeps the lights on in our society, so to speak, and others can be replaced a lot more easily. They're not like as vital, or at least they are more easily replaced, whereas some of them, it's that load-bearing wall. Like you have to, like if it's gone, there's nothing to replace it, and you have to have something to replace it. So like the example I gave earlier was, so Carlin, one of the things that woke her up, our friend Carlin Bursinko, is, her sewing group that she was in. And there was like some, I think, website that went pretty woke and went down this rabbit hole. Well, that's kind of an institution, right? It's kind of a social outlet for you. in some certain way. I'm not, I use that term kind of loosely, but you get what I'm saying. But my point is that your sewing group is not the same as like the CDC. And so the way you would you can start a new sewing group pretty easily, even whenever it comes to media. I think that, we're seeing things like Substack, for example, Medium has actually helped with people being able to post, and write things. Quillette is, I think they have their flaws, but my point is that you can just start a new website. You can start, look at what we're doing, right? We're kind of in that space. And so it's not hard to start something new. Now it might be hard to grow and get it off the ground. It's not going to have the same power or clout, but that's not the same as something like, again, the CDC or the Department of Education, or an entire university or entire university system. And so to your point about how we have to be smart and pick which ones, are the ones worth fighting, I think the question has to be asked is which ones are helping keep the lights on. We like the institutions that are keeping things running at a just brass tacks functional level for society. Those are the ones that we have to take very seriously in terms of making sure that they don't collapse, because I'm okay watching CNN implode. I'm okay watching NPR implode. I'm okay with those things. I'm not so okay watching the US military implode. And so like we have to, and then we'll get into the higher education stuff earlier, because I think we're going to have a fun conversation there. But the point is we have to figure out which ones can collapse on their own, and that we're okay with that they're not load bearing. And we can kind of build something else. We talked about to use Rob Dreyer's, the guy who wrote the Rob or Rod, I don't remember which. Maybe it's Rod Dreher, who wrote the Benedict option. He gives the example at the beginning of the book of, the flood is coming. You just have to try and weather the storm. And so at what point, what he says is, when do you stop stacking sandbags and start building an ark? And so that's the question that we have to ask, is which are the institutions that's like, we need these, we have to fight for them. So we have to keep stacking sandbags. We have to lay siege to try and take them back. And which are the ones that it's like, you just get out of the way of their destruction and separate and try to build your own thing. Does that make sense? So those are the things that I think we need to get into the specifics of.
And I suppose while we're here, I just want to take, because that question actually comes off a question that was submitted on Thinkspot by Vesper Stamper, which if you're on Thinkspot, follow Vesper Stamper. I know she's on there. She's great. You can follow her on just about everything.
She's great.
But I think we've both had her on our podcast. So I just want to read her question out real fast. While I agree with Rod Dreyer's assertion via Vaclav Benda that when institutions are captured, we must create parallel polis, how is this any different from that American Christianity did in response to the 60s sexual revolution by creating alternative music moves, etc., which by definition, suck? I disagree with that. We wouldn't have had Creed if that wouldn't have happened. So there you go.
Yep, that sounds about right.
How can we have, if needed, the Roger Scrutons of the world leading parallel polis universities with complete with degrees instead of second-rate imitations?
So my thought on that,
you can some of that in your
I did, but whenever we talked about it earlier, the point that I made, and by the way, Vesper, that's an excellent question. And so the point I would make is, when I use the word alternative, it has to be a true alternative, right? So think about it like it's do you want to take this car or this car to the store, right? Like those are both viable alternatives to each other. Whereas like, are rollerblades an alternative to a car? I guess kind of, but not really a viable alternative under most circumstances. And so like the example you give of the, Christians who did their own thing and like wrote music and stuff like that's not a viable alternative because it's made for them. If I didn't like music these days and I recorded a bunch of weird stuff for me and like the 12 crazy people like me, I didn't really create an alternative, And so my point is that if we're talking about building viable institutions, like you said, they have to be viable alternatives, which means that they have to sufficiently fill the role of whatever it is they're intended to replace with the people that were using that other institution in the first place. And so, yeah, a Christian doing that kind of thing back in the day. I have so much beef with what the so-called moral majority did, in Christianity basically from the 60s onward. It disgusts me. Everything from the way they handled the AIDS epidemic to trying to, legislate their own morality with anti-sodomy laws, which is just absolutely insane and probably got us, I think, was a big contributing factor to where we are today. But we'll just to kind of close that point off.
That's what I want to yeah. So
well,
I think
guess I'm done. Go ahead.
You're good. With the religious, well, the biggest problem with me with the religious right, just to butt in there a little bit, is it disarms us today. Is because they can point back to that, yeah. and they do the same thing with slavery, which however long ago, but they point back to that and it's like, you're just trying to do what they did. And that is this crazy disarming, which is actually like it's a very useful strategy for them because it's been relatively recent. But it really hurts us. So that's something you always got to be thinking in the future. It's like, okay, don't act like an idiot now. Don't call everything a socialist, just like they call racism. I mean, like I've said before, I think racism is like a bad game of Jeopardy, which every square says racism, and you just got to come up with the question that comes to it. It's like, what? Institution racism, America racism, expired mayonnaise in my fridge racism. It's like we can't do that with socialism and communism and Marxism. But I think it's important to use those terms accurately. But we are in a bit of a language game here, like a language battle, and I think that's part of the hard part about battling within the institutions. So, but just to kind of close out the institutions, like what when you think institutions, you think, man, we're losing these institutions. Like how do you define institutions?
Well,
like how do you separate it from, like, is it just the government or is it these separate things?
Instead of doing that, can I just tell you which specifically I have in mind that I think are the ones that are the most worrying to me? I mean, I can define institution and, it's just an organized.
You don't even have to define it. Yeah. But basically what you're saying.
Yeah. It's an organized thing that we use socially that has some buy-in for some part of the population. I haven't looked up the definition, but that serves some role in society to some group of people that has varying degrees of responsibility or input into the progress or the upkeep or maintenance of a society, for example. So I think the military is an institution that is what we use to help maintain the police, law enforcement. The judicial system is an institution. That's how I vaguely think about it. But I'm thinking more in terms of specifics of which ones are the ones that I look at and I go, if we don't do something, we're going to have nothing left. This is how you end up with, Douglas Murray's example of when the barbarians are at the gate, people will be arguing about what their pronouns are. That's how you get to that point, when you just get into some type of decadence or neglect of what is required for the maintenance of society. Which is, like I was telling you earlier, I have this whole video that I want to do that goes into this theory that I came up with a couple of years ago. And the point being that you can't get so far removed from what keeps the lights on, from what keeps the wheels going. And there are certain institutions, like I said, we have that are load bearing. And those are the ones that I'm worried about specifically. So churches are, religion, or those are institutions. Education is an institution. I wouldn't just say government. I would say the various branches of government and the various functions of government. I'd rather be a little bit more granular with that. Those are institutions. And some are, we can allow those to go. And even individual. So to elaborate a little further, I think there are instances, so we could use the education system, for example, where I think there are specific instances where you can allow one piece of that to implode. So Evergreen College, I'm cool with that imploding, right? That's fine. Like we have so many of those, and we live in such a large country with, so many different things doing the same thing that are all pieces of that institution. That you can have a failure here or there. Think about if I get a cut, I can have a cut on my arm. I can get a couple cuts on my arm, and it doesn't really impact this other arm. But if you get 1,000 paper cuts, what was that movie where the guy was live streaming killing people, where he kills one of the guys with blood thinners and he just gives him paper cuts and lets him bleed to death? the point is that you can only sustain so much damage before a thing becomes is dead and it can't recover. So can we have some of these things that are individual examples where they'll collapse? Yes, that's fine. But I'm thinking about on a macro level, how much of that can we sustain, and how much institutional change that is top down and bottom up in a lot of ways also, but that changes how all of those things operate, that makes it to where they're all going to collapse. They're just might have different timetables. One, it might have happened a few years ago. Another one, it might be in 2 years from now, but the outcome is the same. And so those are the ones that's what I'm thinking about is things like higher ed, different pieces of our government that we don't have viable replacements for. Again, so to kind of close that off, if CNN goes out of business, that's fine. We have Quillette, we have things like Substack, we have Locals, we have Thinkspot, we have these other things where people are actually doing good work in journalism. And like Andy Ngo is doing good journalism. And whether or not NPR, NBC, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they could all go out of business tomorrow, and we'd still have Andy Ngo and Bridget Fetisi and Douglas Murray and Barry Weiss and Matt, who wrote the Hate Incorporated. I don't know why I'm drawing blank on his
Taibbi.
Matt Taibbi. And so we would still have those people, is my point. But there are other things that we don't have that with. And so, but I don't know if that answers your question about the institution. There's kind of a lot there. But you can kind of go wherever you want with that thought.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for institutions, I was just thinking like, what, when you say we have an institution problem, like what does that bring to mind, right? That doesn't bring this government, because like I agree with you that you can't just say government's an institution. There's just too many kind of subsets of government. But when I think of institutions, my list goes from education, healthcare, criminal justice. I'd say science right now is an institution in and of itself. Entertainment, media, military, sports, and organized religion. These are all mainstay institutions that I think I like the term load bearing, because of course some of them are going to be able to be a bit more flexible than others. But once you take one down, it's really hard for the whole system to function. It's going to be very detrimental to all of the institutions, right? So take education as an example. If you have poor education, I mean, that's like shooting off your legs and expecting your arms to just fill in the work. I can crawl on the ground. I can be just as efficient as I am with legs. Well, no, and now your arms are going to tire. Now there's other institutions
very ableist of you.
are going to falter. Right. My bad, guys. I'm sorry. I hope Thinkspot can kick us off for that. But there's actually a whole new subset of OnlyFans that we could have gone on if we would. Never mind. But I would say, yeah, there's certainly more. There's some institutions that are more important than others. But when it comes to load bearing with me, like what does that mean? Does that mean they can't be replaced? Education as an institution, to me, and this is where we got into it a little bit before we called, is I think there is a viable option there. And I actually think there's actually a good, I can't quote it from memory, but in The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek, he talks about how people, every single time there's a big technical revolution, that they think it's going to create a monopoly, because that one industry has been able to monopolize the industry because they're the ones who created that evolution. So you think like Amazon, stuff like that. But I think that it does the exact opposite. I think we have alternatives to CNN because of a technical revolution that allowed information from people like Andy Ngo to get out to people more efficiently and more effectively. So if we can lean into that actually creates alternatives to that institution there, that you can now change over those institutions. And I think the same thing happened with education. To me, I'm an engineer proper. I went to school. I do all this engineering stuff, and I use YouTube as a resource. Although YouTube has a whole bunch of problems with it, I use it as a resource for continuing education. Honestly, I could say that I probably learned more from YouTube almost than I've learned from all of engineering school. So I think YouTube and stuff like that, or institutions or alternatives like that, I should say, can replace what we see as traditional education that we see today. And I mean, we already kind of beta tested it with the pandemic, where kids weren't in school. If they went to public school, they weren't in school at all. So, all those families had to learn how to basically homeschool their kids while they weren't allowed in the school at all. But, do you see that as a viable way to go, as a way to, I don't know if it'd be siege or separation in that context, but it's certainly a way to change of the institution where I think the traditional sense, especially of upper education, is going to eventually die. under the weight of its own administration, just because of how much they built that up and just expected people to keep running through there. And I think a lot of people, especially with all the student debt going on, are going to say, no, it's not worth it. Not worth my time. I can go into welding for 80 grand a year right away with no student debt. It's much better than going to engineering school for a while and maybe starting out the same salary, but with all this debt, then you can't even buy a house. You can't even do all these different things. So I think there are alternatives out there that can crumble these institutions, even though they're seen as load bearing.
Yeah. So there's a few things there. First off, I'll say we've got a lot of really good questions, and I think after this little segment, I want to go into this. I'm not going to deviate, but let's just do where we do questions after this. So I don't want you guys to think that we're not looking. I'm usually really bad about that, but I was just looking. So after
I
this
saw
part,
the
we'll
number
get
pile up,
to
but I have not
questions.
been looking at them specifically. So
there's some really good
happy
ones. So let's just go down the list
Sure.
After that. But so to your point, whenever it comes to higher ed, so first of all, there are way too many people going to college. So that's right. Whenever you said there's a lot of people that are going to say it's not worth it. So that's a different conversation though. But to your point about viable alternative. So maybe I've talked about this before, but one of the things I see is why I think this is, I mean it whenever I say, I think this is probably one of the more ignored but very serious problems we have to think about for the near future. You have to, and I admit that it's one that kind of assumes that we win, but you have to assume that you're going to win whenever you're thinking about things. And that's the problem of credentialing. So what higher ed does is it's a credentialing institution for knowledge sets that translates to skill sets, which is employability, all these other things. And credentialing is a necessary part of society. Now, I think there are things that we have that are total just rent-seeking bullshit in our society in terms of credentialing. So like, the fact that a barber has to get a license to cut hair, I think is insane, for example, but that's a form of credentialing.
So when you say credentialing, just to put it like a difference, would you say it's more of like a sorting mechanism than an educational resource to get someone prepared for a specific field? Is that what you mean by credentialing?
No, I'll get there. You'll understand after what I say what I'm about to say. Yeah. So, and if you don't, just follow up on that. But what I guess it is a form of a sorting mechanism, but it's so here's another thing that's a piece of credentialing, right? I am a neurosurgeon. How do I know that you're a neurosurgeon? I have a piece of paper that says so, that I was given by an institution that can verify my skills and knowledge as a neurosurgeon. So that's credentialing. So that is way more important than a person having a license to cut hair, which is also a form of credentialing. And why I think this is so serious and why I don't think we can just let all of higher education collapse is because we're not going to get aerospace engineers who are studying on YouTube. We're going to get people so I'll use myself, for example. I don't know shit, but everything that I have learned that I talk about, like in this everything that I've done is stuff that's self-taught, from books and YouTube. I guess some of it I pull out of either my bachelor's or my master's, but not near as much. But if I wanted to be in virology or microbiology or some type of chemical engineering or anything in medicine is the one that I'm really worried about. But any of the petroleum engineer, nuclear physicist, take your pick. You're not going to get that on, just from watching videos and reading books, unless you're like a genius who would get it anyway. And so what we have right now is higher ed is a credentialing institution that gives the piece of paper that tells people. So to your question about is it a sorting mechanism? Yes, but there's not another alternative, right? Like if someone said, I'm like a good neurosurgeon, and a person said, well, do you have a degree in it? And I said, well, no, but there's nothing after that conversation, right? Like the end. So it's the only way as of right now that we have for very high skill, very technical, and crucial fields, like again, brain surgery, anything like that, pick something. And so we have our higher education system so you take one institution, let's say Harvard. And I think I might have brought this up in in another conversation we had a while ago, because it's been something that's been stuck in my craw for a while. But where it used to be, if someone says, well, so-and-so went to Harvard, you go, that's a big deal. But now it's, well, what did they major in? And the way they answer that's going to be very different responses from the person hearing it. So if someone says, I went to Harvard and I majored in, pick something, like chemical engineering or whatever it is, or I went to MIT and I got chemical engineering, or poli sci, right? That was my bachelor's anyway. But I went and got, I went to Harvard Law or something like that. You would say, I can assume that you're probably a pretty competent lawyer, or you're pretty competent, whatever this other thing is. But what if they said, I got a degree in women's studies with an emphasis on indigenous medicine, and I'm going into the field, I'm going to get my thesis, I'm getting my doctorate is on something about in diversity, equity, inclusion. That's what I want to do. Now that's a different story. That same institution that's credentialing a thing that we need in society. We do need people that understand law. We do need people that understand, physics and understand all these other things, advanced theoretical mathematics. We need those. That's credentialing them and giving them the piece of paper that we know they're competent, is also credentialing people that have the opposite of something useful, that they're learning things that are not just neutral, like they're just learning something dumb, like underwater basket weaving, right? That was a joke people used to make. But they're learning something and they're getting credentialed in something that is actually destructive to society, that we look at that person, we go, the more people who are like that are unleashed, especially into the upper echelons of corporations and schools and all these other things, the more likely we are to completely be destroyed. So that's what I'm saying is that's where I see as
I would say too.
Go ahead.
If the credential is destructive to credentialing, it's a bad thing, right? Because the limited scope of underwater basket weaving is detrimental to credentialing as a whole, right? It lowers the standard of an education, I would say wholesale, by saying, okay, someone, when they have polling that asks, how many people with a college degree voted for Joe Biden, it's like, to me, that means nothing anymore, because I'm not thinking a bunch of engineers, doctors, and lawyers are voting for Biden. I'm thinking a bunch of people who got these silly degrees that mean nothing, these credentials that mean nothing, are voting for a guy because they at least validate that credential. So I think there's a problem there. And just to go back on an example, and I didn't mean to ruin your steam there, but you talked about something like aerospace. That was actually my discipline going through engineering school. And I can tell you, although my engineering school is terrific, I have nothing but amazing things to say, because mine was a bit unique. Mine was like an engineering school that was just taught by engineers. So it was like very hands-on type stuff. But I can tell you that someone could probably be a decent aerospace engineer by watching YouTube. Like literally by just taking classes on there, you'd be doing the same thing. So I think there is a little bit of wiggle room in there.
But where are they going to get a job?
Well, that's the thing. Like if you're hiring, you need to look at, and I think a lot of people look at this as some sort of sorting mechanism. So I know people like, I've never been to an institution like Harvard or Stanford, all those guys, but I know people like Ben Shapiro, who says, you go in there and they tell you, all right, you already made it. You're already here. It's just you getting into this already made that credential perfect for you. All you got to do is get through it. So that acts as a sorting mechanism that really hurts the value of that credential. And normally, like any STEM field, there is post-ed credentialing. There is continuous education that you take while you're working, and it just says, I'm certified in this type of, engineering field, this type of modeling, this type of stuff like that, that helps you build your resume. And that's really the important credentialing, because that tells you what this person's able to do while working in the field and really kind of narrow down on what they're really, really good at. And I think post-credentialing, post-ed credentialing is something that's much more important than just pure education credentialing. So I think, that in and of itself,
but one serves as a doorway to the other. So the education credentialing is what it's a progression. So if this part's broken, then what comes after it is going to be compromised as well, to varying degrees, sure, but is going to be compromised as well. So sorry, go on with what you're saying, but then I wanted to make a point on that.
Well, I mean, I agree with you there, but that's a change in strategy, right? So if you're a hiring manager, I think, for me, someone who does hire engineers, I see your engineering degree just means that you are someone who's authentically interested in engineering. That's all it really tells me. Like I want to know, because when I interview people, what I look for is this thing called intellectual curiosity. I want to know if you're willing to do the work without me telling you you have to, right? That's
Sure,
the
but
most
how many
important thing to
hiring
me. And college
managers
is not telling me that.
subscribe to that, right? So very few.
A lot more than you think, actually. There actually is a good
Put a
movement
percent on
moving
it.
toward this type of strategy.
Try to put a percent on it
Maybe
among
like
all
30%, maybe like 30%,
high skill,
not high.
among all high skill careers, among include medicine, include physics, include chemistry.
So there are things I agree with you. Like, I don't want a brain surgeon checking on YouTube and checking on my brain to figure out. So there are definitely fields out there that I think need to maintain this traditional type of credentialing. Although I would say, if you look at those med field, you know, my fiance is in nursing, and they do a lot of hands-on stuff. They do clinicals. They actually like do the work to make sure they understand how the work works. So I think there's a bit of a difference there in how they learn. You know, being a doctor is a very, very long process when you're a resident. And, you know, I've seen the show Scrubs, so I know how it goes. But you know, there's I think it's a bit of a different strategy there than just being an engineer or something like that. That I think, you know, engineer is a field that I would say it's kind of on the tipping point that you could or you couldn't. But really, I mean, when you're talking outside STEM, you're talking about outside medicine, you're talking about outside law. Like, what fields really, really need this credential to get in there? And what could use
and that's my point,
post-education credential?
I'm talking about the load-bearing ones, which aren't the ones that are outside of those things. So the ones that are outside of those things, we agree. Like, I'm like, yeah, no, people can learn those things. And that's why I'm not worried about them. I am worried about the load-bearing ones, which, like you said, so your fiance is in nursing. She's hands-on via what? Via the institution she's getting her degree from. And so that's it. That's the credentialing she's getting from that higher education. And so that's my point, is that we're talking about two different things. I agree on the other stuff. You're right. Like, do we need college for a lot of these other things? No, I don't think we do. And if someone is a good hiring manager, they're going to say, look at what's your skill set, what's your knowledge. They're going to be able to sort that stuff out in one conversation. Now, there is a problem where most companies these days are using, especially bigger ones, are using software to screen out resumes. And so you have to have certain things on the resume. Otherwise, it does a set of eyes doesn't even get on it. And so that's also part of that credentialing problem. But we agree on the other part. I'm saying, so you're saying, okay, outside the STEM, yeah, we agree. I'm talking about inside the STEM. Yeah. We have to look at the credentialing problem of, we cannot just abandon the institutions that are continuing to go full idiocracy. And because we have to have the people that are being credentialed. That's what keeps the lights on. That's what keeps America first in, you know, cancer survival rates, for example, is having that type of quality of doctors and oncologists and radiologists, those types of things, that we are the ones creating the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks and those kinds of things. Like, we have to have a system that helps foster that kind of, and nurture and grow that kind of intelligence and channel it into the fields where it's going to help keep the lights on for the system. And all we have right now are these higher education systems that are simultaneously creating the people that are keeping the system going, and also credentialing the people that are destroying the system. And that's crazy. That's crazy town. You can't have that. But I don't know what the answer is. But that's what was really worrying me, is I'm like, because you know how I think about generational, just real fast, how I think about generational thinking about I've done the thing of like kids in Portland versus Wyoming or something like that, and their ability to engage in reality and whatever. But think dynamically down the line of time, just 20 years from now, of this generation, and then what med school is going to look like, and what MIT is going to look like. I mean, Vesper brought up the point of how there's some accounting program in New York that isn't even looking at white applicants. Yeah. So fast forward 20 years, which is a long time, especially if you think back what the US was like 20 years ago. And then you can look, okay, no, things can change rapidly. And I think this stuff adheres to Moore's law. I think it's all exponential anyway. But my point is that tell me that generation, the way the trajectories are moving, are capable of keeping the lights on, are capable of running a functioning military, are capable of doing these things. They won't be. They won't be. So we have to figure out, those are the ones that I'm like, I don't know how we rebuild, or do we take a few specific colleges and try to lay siege to them and say, look, we got to take this back so that it's a competent credentialing mechanism.
This is,
I don't know, but that's what terrifies me. That's what terrifies me.
So I think where we diverged here is I'm thinking education wholesale as something that is a load bearing that you cannot get rid of, or you cannot destroy any institutions that lie within that arena. And I think, you let someone like an institution like Harvard, Stanford, all the Ivy Leagues, just take them. If they all fell today, they all went bankrupt and ceased to exist, we wouldn't run out of lawyers. We wouldn't run out of these credentialed people. The demand would come from somewhere else. Someone else would feed that demand. Someone who's hopefully more responsible, I think, would feed that demand. But, I agree with you that there are bits and pieces within education that cannot fall. They cannot fall. We got to lay siege to that. I think medicine is a big one. If we keep giving ground in medicine, and there's a whole bunch of different ways we're doing that right now, that'll be extremely damaging to everyone who relies on medicine, aka everyone. So, I think there's a big difference there. And when we talk about siege versus separation, I mean, we really need to focus in on what institutions we're looking at. Military is one that is siege. There's no other option than siege, because if we lose that, I mean, we're going to have to learn Mandarin or something like that, because there's no way that we're going to be the same country we are today as we are in, a couple of generations from now. So that's something we obviously need to maintain. It is crazy to me that is starting to crumble. But I think education, the way we view education, I mean, I'm not even talking about upper education, looking at, if you have kids right now who are in a public school, or even like charters, and even some like private schools, you look at that and like, I don't know how this can be sustained. If you're not preparing kids for the real world, but you're preparing them for some imaginary world that you want them to grow into, they're preparing them for utopia, expecting utopia to be there when they're out being adults. That is an institution that I think needs to crumble. I don't know how you can
K through 12
wholesale again. Wholesale.
No, and
so I think we're having a lot of agreement here, but
I don't think we even have any disagreement, to be honest. I just think what we got getting the specifics, but but K through 12, I mean, public education is a novel thing. It hasn't been around for that long, and we built entire societies and civilizations without it. So no, we totally agree. I think we need to abolish the Department of Education outright. I'm there. I detest all of it. So, but and my point is let's say you get a kid who's homeschooled by good parents or whatever, and they want to go on to be a neurosurgeon. I use that one. And then it's like, what's the institution they're being brought into? Like, how can they, what if they don't agree with the politics that's being injected into this stuff? Now that kid might get self-selected out where they can't even be part of it if they won't admit to their privilege or some shit. And so then now you've even put this perverse, again, another sorting mechanism in where the only people getting accepted in these programs are the ones who are, going to practice, what James Lindsay's talked about, that medical Lysenkoism. And that's not good. That's obviously not good. We're on Thinkspot. So Jordan Peterson, it's not good, it's, and so we do that at our peril, right? As he would say. And those are the things that I think about. And so I don't know what the answer is with them. And again, it's not like this is some monolithic thing. It is on some level, but states have various controls and things like that. So I think with higher education, and then after this, we should probably get to some questions because there's some really, really good ones in there. But with higher education, my thought is we have to pick the ones that are probably capable of being salvaged. That you can see there's people in there fighting, and then put a hell of a lot of support behind those, because there is a good thing with, having these test cases, right? So for example, you have a university, let's say, that expels this stuff, that says, no, we're just going to do this. I know this is a crazy thing, but we're just going to do academia. And we're not going to do this other crazy shit. And then what's going to, again, to quote Lindsay, I think he said, the way he put it is, if universities did that, the first one that does is going to go gangbusters because of all the professors that just want to teach and not be a part of all this crap. But the problem is you'd have to get a university that is, fully independent, isn't reliant on some type of federal funds, because they'll get these dear colleague letters, saying you have to, practice this garbage and push this religion on people. But once you get that, then you're going to have the people with the degrees from that university they're going to be competent, and ideally you do have to have, it's not just that they have to have the right beliefs. They also have to be competent. So, there is that. They can't just say 1619 is bad. They also have to know what the hell they're doing in these various jobs that they're being credentialed in. But I think if we have a few universities that do that, and it's just a matter of figuring out which ones those are, then we're going to have the test cases, right? It's going to be like, how's this one doing compared to that one? Well, the kids that graduate from that don't know their ass from a hole in the ground. And the kids that graduate from this one are competent in, whatever it is they're doing, aerospace engineering, or whatever you're talking about. So I think that's a practical answer, but we just don't have access to knowing which ones, are doing this. I know that there's a lot of stuff that happened at Smith College recently. But we don't know. We've heard about it in the businesses, but it seems like every story about the universities are ones that are going further down this path, not ones that are pulling away from it. And so that's where I say, my basic thought is we can't let all of them fall because we need doctors, right? We can't let all of them fall. They all seem to be going that way and only getting worse. And so we need to find which ones, I guess, are the best, worst answer and try to support people there, because we're not going to get, molecular biologists and people doing all this stuff that are load bearing parts of society from YouTube. We have to have something. And part of that, again, goes into getting the federal government out of higher education, which is a whole nother thing. But yeah, so that's where I think about this. And this is the stuff that keeps me awake. It really does. I stew on this because I'm like, what the hell? Who's going to do surgery in 35 years? What are the surgeons going to be like?
And part of the strategy, especially when we talk about siege, and I'll make this quick and get to questions right after, part of the strategy of siege and separation isn't always necessarily sieging those institutions, the Harvards, the Stanfords, all those guys. It is to siege in the private industry. It is to refuse to wholesale bring on these ideologies, because, to bow down to the woke mob like we've seen all these large corporations do. That is part of how you need to fight back, because if you have a doctor who's spending their time learning about woke medicine and then how 2 + 2 = 5, or an engineer who believes 2 + 2 = 5, or will believe in that type of doctrine, I mean, that is bandwidth they're using to buy into these ideas and to try to express these ideas in the private industry, which is less time, less effort they're using toward their actual practice. So it's also a fight that's needed in the private industry to say, I'm not going to hire people who are buying into this stuff, because now their motives to help me as a company are changing from, I want to make sure I make the best product possible, or do the best procedure possible, the most efficient and effective way possible, to I need to express my social aspiration, my political aspirations while I'm doing my work, which really takes your focus away from your work. So you have to do it at more than one level. It's not just fighting the institution. It is telling these companies, hey, like, do what you're here to do, and you don't have to do this extra stuff. Like, I'll do this extra stuff on the side, but do what you have to do. Coke, make me Coke. I don't need you making me woke Coke, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the other Coke side of this battlefield.
Go woke, go Coke. So let's answer some of these questions on here. So James of Commutation Construct had a good
He's
question.
He's also on Thinkspot, by the way, so give him a follow.
Yes, that's right.
If you haven't already.
And he says, so he has two parts. He asks a question, then he builds on it a little bit later. He says, sometimes the best strategy is to just target a single entity for influence and spread from there once the action is complete. Here's, I would say it's probably going to be never complete with what we're in right now. But here's a question. Do you believe there is any institution that the right could target? I would not say just the right, but the people who aren't buying into the shit, but I think that's probably what you mean, could target and succeed that the left, so let's substitute right and left with the sane versus insane, could target, and the insane would not immediately recognize and march back against in numbers, that the sane could hope to match. The left, the insane, tends to be far better at organizing collective action. So how can we even be sure that our new institutions would be immune to the influence of the insane? And then he says, addendum to my question before, I believe the left has either a messiah or a Satan complex, believing that only they know what is right for all humanity and they must guide people, or they purposefully want to hurt people while acting good. And the right seems to have an apostle complex, looking for a divine leader to guide them and otherwise wanting to be left alone. James, there's a lot here, buddy. Do you think there is a merit to this? And how do you think this would affect the ability of the right to fight back institutionally, considering that? So my thoughts, and if I understand the question, you can put it in the chat, is it seems twofold. So you're asking about just maybe some pathologies or psychological quirks that are endemic to these different sides. We'll call it, I don't want to just use left, right, because there are people on the left who are very much fighting this stuff as well. So, but we'll just say
they're on the right now.
Yeah, well, that's not them being on the right. That's the line moving. They didn't make
right.
that. That's the goalpost going. But anyway, so to your second question is like, well, what about these psychological quirks? Maybe, I don't know. These are the types of things that I think are possibly relevant, but I don't personally feel like we have the luxury to be thinking about too much, to be honest. Like, why does the left do this and why is the right like this? Like, there's probably some utility to that in certain circumstances, but for me, and again, this might sound alarmist, conspiratorial, you can tell me if you think so, but I just don't think we have a lot of time to sit and navel gaze on some of these things. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, James, but like, is it possible? Like, because we talked about this in our Ember thing, the left is very well organized because they're collective. I got a YouTube ad yesterday. There was some alarmist climate change thing where the video slowly caught fire and it said, be a global citizen. It was all about being global citizen, right? They had this kind of globalist utopian, just completely detached from the real world thought on how things work. And the right is more individualistic. And so they necessarily need someone to guide them because they have the thought that, well, I'm not going to tell someone else what to do because I don't want to do that. And so they're going to be very choosy about that. But those are all things that I frankly don't think, I think they're probably interesting to think about. And again, there's probably some specific instances where there might be some utility and maybe even a lot of utility in sorting that out. But I think more about the specifics, which is what was in your first question, which are there specific institutions that the sane people could try to infiltrate? And I would go, in terms of higher ed, which is one of the main ones I think about, is find the colleges where people are maybe fighting this that are potentially able to be salvaged and infiltrated, and go for that. Maybe where these activists don't have a big foothold ideologically, or at least in the hierarchy and the hiring and all that other stuff. Now they're getting there where you have to have a statement on your resume. What have you done to openly advocate for equity and all these other things? So find the ones that aren't there yet and try to infiltrate and support those. Other ones, I think they're mediums like Thinkspot or Locals, where you have independent content creators that are talking about these things. I think are ones that are. So I'm going to maybe, I guess, slightly alter what you asked about. Are there specific institutions? I would put that in the media institution, where people are, the media, you would say is largely a lens for helping people make sense of the world, of what's going on, and also some kind of it gives them information. It's a town square, that town crier, the young boy that would rock around with the bell. It was a thing for giving people information about what was going on, and also a lens for helping them understand those events and ideas and things. And so I think that's pretty easily salvaged, to be honest, because I think the other ones are just going to die. Now, there's a whole nother thing where, again, this isn't new to anyone who's listening to me talk about these things, but where I say the big tech creates a huge complication there, in that, in the early days of tech, anytime there was some stuff with news, they were looking for ways, who's the credible sources for news? And so that's where you get Twitter, propping up things from NBC and NPR and CNN and MSNBC, and YouTube, Google does the same thing. And, the example I give is that it's like Rose's family from Titanic, she's bankrupt, her family's broke. But this guy that she's thinking about marrying, that wants to marry her, doesn't know that. And so they are living on, her mom tells her this, we're living on name only, reputation only. We have all these debts. We're not going to be able to survive for much longer. And so that good name, she's hoping to marry into a family that will give her wealth and basically backfill a lot of that wealth that they lost, and basically reestablish that credibility on the back end. And I think that's what's happened with big tech and a lot of these news organizations, in that MSNBC and CNN, they're intellectually bankrupt. They have no credibility whatsoever. But, if you're YouTube early days, Twitter early days, I actually do understand why they would be like, well, we don't have anyone else to, we're going to put this up and share this and put this on trending or put it on the front page because there's these events going on. These are the institutions that talk about it. So yeah, we're going to cite these guys. And so that's added credibility and basically further entrenched these failing and intellectually and now morally bankrupt media entities into the system via, marrying into big tech. But that's a whole nother thing. My point is that I think those are ones that are pretty salvageable. I think find the specific colleges and some of the new media. I think actually I've totally changed my opinion on this, what Ben Shapiro is doing at Daily Wire and them of like having movies and doing this stuff and having alternatives. I think those are good because those aren't load bearing. There is some degree where entertainment is kind of load bearing. Music is load bearing. I mean, there's trumpets and stuff in the Bible, and so these are things that have been around for a long time that civilizations have used. And so, like, to some degree, sure.
Let's talk about that entertainment. What I wish they'd do is go into comedy more, because that's one I think you and I agree with that is. Oh yeah. Is much more important. I think comedy and sports are these two ones that we kind of think, okay, they're just entertainment, whatever. We kind of brush them off.
Vital. Those are load bearing. Those are load bearing
influences. Yeah, that's huge influence on the culture.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100% agree. Yeah. And so, well, I mean, that's pretty much it. So James, with those, I think comedy, I mean, to what Kevin was just saying. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one where if you have good comedians that are funny, they can do that via YouTube. They can do that, in these other outlets. They can do that via locals. I mean, Josh Denny, he's great. He's doing events and stuff. I mean, he did the Ginormous Foods. His locals is great, by the way. I always make the mistake of watching episodes of Ginormous Foods like 2 a.m. and I'm like, holy shit! Like I could have eaten like an hour ago, and I have to go and get food. But anyway, my point is that yeah, there's opportunity there. And that's places where we have wiggle room for like some of this stuff to crumble and other stuff to kind of rise from those ashes. Those are, to go to the load bearing metaphor, Kevin and I were talking about this before we got started. But let's say you have a wall and you're going to do something with a house and you have a load bearing wall and you have to take it out. Well, what you actually get is these industrial jacks, or you build the thing first and then take the other thing out. But if you're not going to build the thing first, if you can't do that, if you have to take the whole wall out, you get these industrial jacks to literally hold your ceiling up and keep your house or building, whatever you're in, stable while you're replacing that load bearing thing. That's what load bearing means. Like you remove this, comes down. Like the structural integrity of this is dependent of this building or whatever is dependent on this thing. And so you have to have a replacement. So the ones where we don't have as much wiggle room for, can one thing kind of crumble, another thing kind of, rise organically. Higher ed is one of them, medicine. And then as we talked about, like the military, CDC is another one, like the things that are like with virology. These are load bearing things that we don't have the time to screw around and to kind of just let it play out and let it burn. We have to actually be thinking actively about what we can do there. But that's my thoughts on what James said. Kevin, I don't know what you got. There is a lot there. There's a good question, by the way, James. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to institutions that the right could focus on, so the military is one that you see their messaging is getting very woke, but I really think that is an outward facing messaging problem. The people involved, the PR part of the military are trying to go woke, while the people in the military are rejecting it wholesale. Like they don't care about this stuff. The problem is if they do this long enough, then they're going to start attracting people who care about it, and then they're going to end up joining the military. So that will be a problem if it just goes ignored, which what I would say the traditional right, the conservatives, tend to ignore these problems until they become too big and not able to control. So I'm not saying ignore the military problem, ignore the messaging, the stupidity that we're seeing come out of there, because I don't really care about, I don't mean to be rude about it, but like when it comes to discrimination in the military, I don't really care about that stuff. That's the point of the military, is to make sure we stay safe. It's
you need to expand on what you meant by discrimination. I assume you're talking about like trans stuff, like not like racial stuff. Okay.
Yeah. Trans stuff. Women in the military. I've tutored
women in combat roles. In combat roles.
Yeah. For like the flight program, you know, I've tutored women who I'm all like, wow, these people are amazing and they should be in the military. But there are like roles that we don't want. We don't want equality on the front lines because that's going to get people killed who shouldn't be killed, right? So there's a big difference between those two. But what I'm saying now is I don't think the military has gone woke. I think the messaging's gone woke, but this does not mean you just ignore them, because they are attracting people who think, oh, this is like, I'm going to get to wear all these cool uniforms and stuff. Like, they're not going to care about the military part of the military, and they're going to care about the messaging part. So I'm just saying, don't ignore those. Now, when it comes to, you know, a lot of these institutions that are, I'm not going to say right wing, but they don't care. You know, engineering is a good field of people who I think really their personalities kind of line up more, I would say, more right wing, more conservative. They're more insular. They don't really care about the outside world. They more look at what they're doing and they focus on their practice. But they're generally easy pushovers, so it's easy for them to mimic the message here. Whereas, you know, if I'm an engineering manager and I have total control of hiring, you know, I'm going to make sure I hire someone who cares about engineering. Now, the problem is, and the smart thing that the left did, is they infiltrated administrative and HR roles, which even at an unwoke company can easily be infiltrated by the people who buy into this doctrine, this woke doctrine, and take over the HR and administrative roles that include hiring. So like you said, if you have to put something at the bottom of your resume saying I volunteered for this, you know, LGBTQ alphabet people organization, that could be a must when going into a role that has nothing to do with politics. And that's when the problem arises. And that's when you need to push back. And that's really the leadership within the company to say, all right, we need administration to do administration work. We don't need them to do, you know, work outside. They don't need to be PR campaigns, right? So we need to actually focus on what makes the company better, because once you start adding these people in who care more about this other stuff instead of doing their job, everyone hurts. The company hurts, the consumer hurts, the society hurts, and we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that's the scary part of the load-bearing issue, is that can kind of move around to whatever companies end up getting woke, like Coke. Like Pepsi's an alternative to Coke. We got that stuff. You know, if I don't want to drink soda, I just want to drink soda. It's a big difference between the military, right? The military crumbles and we could lose everything. So, you know, it's really picking those battles, but to understand they're kind of infiltrating everywhere. And even if it doesn't seem important to you, if you're in your own personal capacity, you can make a difference there by speaking up and saying, we need to make sure we focus on the task and not alternative tasks. That's going to be important to make sure you keep your industry, you know, on track to do what your industry does best and not try to do all these ulterior political things, basically.
Yep. So read this other question? I was going to ask if we could read this other question by Red Point. So he said, nice, look at you. Jinx, do you think institutions were deliberately dominated by the left or organically subsumed by something fundamental to the liberal mindset? If deliberate, what were the organizational mechanisms? And if organically, how could the right achieve results that were inherent to the liberal mindset? And I think he asked another one. No, this Clark asked a bunch of really good questions. We gotta try and synthesize these ones from Clark. He had some really good ones. Let's hit red points and we can get to that one. What do you think about that? To what he asked about how this stuff happened?
I mean, there's always been the idea, and this is kind of played out in The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, kind of talking about the different, you know, what leaves you predisposed to more of a liberal mindset to a conservative mindset. And he talks about how the more liberal mindset is better at, you know, making these new companies, right? You know, Amazon started by, you know, Jeff Bezos, who's much more liberal, and you go down the line of all these crazy tech companies that were created by people who are extremely liberal because they were able to take that chance. And then he talks about how the right comes in and they're really, really good managers. It's like, all right, you created this cool thing, let me manage it so it actually makes you money. So I think you run into a little bit of problem there where it's not as deliberate as much as it just is happenstance that these people ended up creating these institutions that are more liberal in mindset. But, you know, when it comes to, let me read the question. You know, it's definitely a combination of both, where, like we talked about before, where, you know, the administrative part of the company and the HR part of the company can come into a relatively, again, I don't want to say right wing, but a non-political company and kind of take it over and make sure they're only hiring people who believe in the certain thing and have those tick marks off on their resume. So, you know, I think it's a bit of both, but I think if we don't pay attention and we don't If we don't recognize the people kind of drifting from their original scope, you can have, a company like Nick Jr. who's making stuff for kids turn into now propaganda of the left. And now they're just mimicking all those major institution talking points that kind of flipped overnight to say, we want to teach your kids the ABCs to saying we want to teach your kids about, non-binary parents and stuff like that. So you have to pay attention if you're someone who, actually cares about that, which I mean, really anyone who has kids should be caring about that. So I think it's a bit of both that, it happens certainly organically in some places, but the institutional capture is certainly deliberate. We've heard people like F.A. Hayek and the Road to Serfdom that they purposefully go in the institutions and try to almost terraform it to their beliefs.
Yep.
And that's something you need to recognize. And the right has never had a very good response to that. They always say institutions, they kind of go the libertarian Ayn Randian type of response saying, well, you're private, you get to do whatever you want, although I don't like it, doesn't matter, I don't get any input. And I think that ineffectualness really hurt them in the end by not pushing back against stuff that they saw, even though they're not directly involved with it, to give them, the feedback that they really should have needed.
Yeah. So I agree. I think that it was probably a little bit, not just a little bit, it was overtly intentional. So I had to get my names right. But so it was Rudi Dutschke, who is a communist activist who coined the term the long march through the institutions. And he was influenced by Antonio Gramsci, who was also communist, who talked about cultural hegemony and the necessity of infiltrating the culture and breaking up the hegemonic culture that exists to sustain itself and sustain its oppressive ways.
He's also the one that kind of queued up the cultural Marxism, that he took Marxism from Gramsci, purely academic, more expanded.
Yeah, and Herbert Marcuse, who is a big influence on the thinking of the modern left, repressive tolerance guy, he wrote Rudi Dutschke at one point and said, I absolutely agree with your long march to the institutions point. This was in the 70s. And so, yeah, I mean, what I have discerned, and a lot of this comes from Stephen Hicks and then later stuff that has been substantiated and reaffirmed by someone. Hicks, I think, is also on Thinkspot quite a bit. Someone like James Lindsay, is that, whenever the revolution didn't happen after World War II, and actually the middle class was growing, the way Hicks puts it is this is basically a religious belief for these people. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. And they just decided to stick with their faith. And their faith was the world would be a better place if this was the way it operated. And so they had to reconceptualize what they were going to do. And then they infiltrated academia and the other institutions. You see a lot of, we're reading through Road to Serfdom, and Hayek writes about that. And especially in the updated versions in the mid 50s. And then later, I think the 74 edition, that was like the 30-year anniversary of it, where he talks again about like what he's seeing happen in growing government bureaucracies that are circumventing liberty, just taking shortcuts to get things done. And so to your point, or to your question, Red Point, I think is absolutely intentional. It's a very good strategy. The fact that it's just now bubbling up. So there's a lot of people that are like, man, this happened overnight. No. This happened over the last 70 years. And the ideology has been growing like a cancer in academia for longer than that. We're talking over 100 years. And so, yeah, that's why it's good to know that, not just from some type of, you have all this semantic kind of esoteric knowledge about, Gramsci and all these other, these different people, but so that we understand the entrenched nature of this problem. If you think that it happened overnight, I'm not saying you do, but I'm saying people who think that it happened overnight, then they might be persuaded that there is a quick solution, right? Which just isn't the case. We are playing catch up with an enemy that has a many decades long head start on us. And so we're going to have to be creative in how we go about handling this. We're going to have to think differently. And so to your question, if it happened organically or is just some kind of thing that just kind of happened, those options aren't available to us. Now, there is something to be said for the fact that, I think you mentioned the righteous mind a minute ago, that people on the left think about implementing their ideology as a systemic top-down thing whenever they get into positions of power. That probably does just kind of happen. If you're the kind of person who James Lindsay did a really good, I think it might have been an Only Subs, I don't remember, but New Discourses thing within the last maybe 2 months or so, where he talked about people being institutionalized. Like if you're in academia your whole life, you believe that the institution, you're in this little hermetically sealed thing where you can go anywhere and a person takes care of your issues, and you can go to this department or whatever, and all these enlightened, nice people take care of everything. And you think, God, if only the whole country was run like this, right? And so it's this institutional problem where you think institutionally that the institution becomes the fundamental unit of society in your mind, rather than something like the family or your extended, like close, like social relationships. And so, yeah, there probably is something to be said about just natural proclivities of just the psychological bent of people that have different ideologies. But in terms of this specific thing, very intentional, very strategic, very smart. You have to give them credit for the amount of patience. And again, to quote Hayek, one of the reasons why Kevin and myself have been mentioning him is because we're going to be doing a video series going over the road to serfdom, by the way. And so we got Hayek on the brain, which is a good thing to have on the brain, by the way. So stay tuned for that stuff. It's going to be good. It's one of the best. Yeah, the book is mind blowing, dude. Knocks your socks off. It's great. And then puts them back on just so it can knock them off again on the next page. But one of the things that he talks about in, I believe it's the introduction to the release in is like maybe 1956 re-release. I think it was 56.
Their American version. So 53,
yes, the American version.
I believe, was the American release or something. Yeah, 56. Okay. No,
I don't know, but anyway, the point is one of the criticisms he addresses is people say, well, how come Britain didn't become this authoritarian thing? How come it didn't become like Nazi Germany? If you say that if people go down this road, that they'll become that. And he said, one of the main themes of the book is it takes generations. This is going to take some time for something people to get fully entrenched in this. And so don't want to get too much into the stuff that Kevin and I are going to talk about in those videos. You're going to have to check those out for yourself whenever we're going to probably do the first one maybe this weekend. I don't know. But the point is that they had a smart strategy that was the long con, man. You watch movies, they talk about the long con. This is the long con. In terms of just infiltrating the institutions and incremental change, taking over the bureaucracies and changing the policies, changing the curriculum, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, we don't have that type of time. One is the main one. We don't have time. I don't think we do. My guess is we have less than 10 years to course correct, or else America's toast. And I'm happy to eat those words if I'm wrong. I hope I do. But that's how I think about it. So we don't have the time. And we also don't have those strategies because, like I said earlier, I think they took over the castle and then they raised a drawbridge and put guards on the wall. But it's a good question. It's a problem solving question. So I dig that. I wish that I was not as cynical about that, but I don't know. Kevin, do you think is that too cynical, or what do you think there?
Yeah. So the only reason that I allow some space for the organic changes, I think we've seen that in big tech a little bit, where you've seen people who are just very high in openness who are willing to. I think it's the Dorsey guy, the Twitter dude. Don't even remember his name.
Jack Dorsey
Jack Dorsey is one of those guys. I think is high in openness. So when he runs the company, it's easy to infiltrate that. Although you could say that is inorganic change because of the indoctrination through the way he was brought up. So it's kind of hard to specify, but I do agree with you. In general, they planned this for a very, very long time. And even talking about the academics, going back to Hayek, he talks about kind of how the academics get frustrated that they can play with these ideas in academia and they work, but they don't work in real life. And now when they got to apply it to real life, they go into this strategy of planning. It's like, okay, this will work if I get to set all these conditions. And that is how you turn a state that is as nice and plentiful as Germany was in the early 20th century to the totalitarian state that we saw in the mid 20th century. That change can happen fairly rapidly, but also there is a very intentional aspect to it that's slowly moving it across the finish line, whether delivered or not. This is the route they're going, and that's really the message that Hayek's trying to give. It's like, even though you think you're doing something right for the right reasons, just like think about it before you do it and kind of understand. Leads. I mean, it's a little bit of the slippery slope argument where before it's time. The only problem with the slippery slope argument is 99% of the time it comes true. So, which makes it very annoying, but unfortunately, that's just the way it works.
Are you cool if we get to Clark's questions? Because he's had some really good questions. He even posted, he's like, hey guys, good conversation, but you need to get to the questions. And I think he's totally right. He's got some good stuff here. So the first one he asked is he's got a lot. So I'm just going to read through these and then we can talk about it. Does that sound right? Yeah, he says,
that's great.
What do you think of the false left-right paradigm? Which I love even the way they're beginning, because he's totally right. This is not left versus right. In other words,
I was actually going to try to read this question real quick when you're reading the other question, because you complained about the right left thing, and I'm like, oh, perfect.
Yep.
So Clark B14, you're right on it, man.
Yep. He's when votes are reviewed, it becomes quickly apparent that the left-right options are used primarily as an excuse to not pass legislation that is for the people as a whole. Totally agree. Whereas those votes that prefer the corporatocracy tend to be closer to gain by bipartisan support. After spending a career in politics and government, I can easily state that as long as we allow ourselves to continue to view a left versus right battle, we will not be able to solve the real problem we are fighting. Yes, 100%. CNN and NBC et al. Will not go out of business. They will morph into something else. We need to be careful about what they morph into. For example, we thought that when the USSR went out of business in the 80s, I love this guy's metaphors. This is great. We thought that we'd have a peace dividend. Well, all that meant was the powers that be simply pivoted into a war on terror. Those folks make a great deal of money, and getting them off the public sugar tea is very difficult. And then he said, is the left really so together, or are they simply better funded by the powers that be who want us to stay at each other's throats? God, dude, this guy is great. These are awesome questions. Think of the past 40 years. Roe v. Wade was a real social litmus test. Gay marriage, feminism, transgenderism, all these very polarizing items that keep our minds off our financial problems and off who's picking our pockets, as something Eric Weinstein would say. 80-year-old senators and congressmen, never-ending wars, too big to fail, something to think about. So he put a lot there. Let's touch on the left versus right, and then that last thing he said about what is it actually the left, or is it something else? Something I would call the establishment, or Michael Malice refers to as a cathedral. Go on any of the stuff that Clark said, because he had a hell of a lot of good stuff there. So just what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So the left-right paradigm, Clark, to me, I never really. Yeah. Great questions, by the way, and way to stay on us for the questions. You missed one saying you guys had a great. Well, you said that at the beginning.
Yeah.
But I get the question strongly advised. That left-right paradigm, to me, as I would say the conservative, more libertarian as well, was I love the left-right paradigm because it creates gridlock and no one accomplishes anything. To me, that was always great. And this is, again, my thinking like more in 2015, 2016. I was always like, the more you fight, the better it is for me. People always said the government is never supposed to have this two-party problem, or it's only two really viable parties in America. I always thought this was a great thing because it's going to create gridlock. But you brought up a good point. As this gridlock's happening in these ideas that we think we care about, behind the scenes, the only bipartisanship is on stuff we should actually be horrified by, on stuff on spending, going to war, all these different things
war on terror,
they're doing behind our backs. So it's this great, it's this great kind of magic trick that it's like, oh, hey, look over here in this hand as we're doing gridlock and, complaining. And this is where CNN and Fox News all are focusing on this stuff, while this stuff over here is just sliding through, man, bipartisanship. And that's why I always used to say, like, if anything is bipartisan, that normally is a thing we should look at and be like, no, stop doing that, because that is the worst thing for us. So I think you had a great observation there. And this is kind of part of my political evolution, again, from not voting for Trump in 2016 because he wasn't Mitt Romney enough for me. And now going from then to being like, okay, I'm willing to vote for this guy because he's pointing out the BS. Sometimes it's happening in the background, although I think he perpetuated it a little bit in some places like spending, but at least he stopped the war, stopped this type of stuff that he was able to highlight later. So, I think it's a great observation where you find this gridlock and this disagreement that's being covered by all the big stations, but you're not seeing the parts that are getting passed and being just overlooked by the American people because it's not important enough for us, right? We don't care much about fiscal policy because it's sometimes too confusing. We don't want to think about it. And, that's the stuff that just slides right through. And that's the stuff that actually affects your life down the line.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Everything you said. Taibbi writes about that in Hate Incorporated about the bipartisan nature of take the Patriot Act, for example, or, going into Iraq or Afghanistan and Iraq. To your question, Clark, I'm going to meld both of them because the second one, I think, feeds to think about what CNN stuff might morph into. I don't know. They might just be integrated. There's always going to be activists that are part of this shit. CNN is just activist opportunists that are, again, to quote Taibbi, where he talks about how journalists used to be people who were part of the middle class, and then they are the elites. And so what CNN morph into, it's not the same as the USSR. There's going to be activists in all these fields, so I'm not as worried about that. And I'm open to your input if you have something specific in mind of what you think they'll morph into that we should be. But I'm not worried about there being like people spewing bullshit on the internet, because that's kind of always going to be the case, so I'm just more interested in the amount of institutional control. It's kind of the question where people talk about like white supremacists or KKK and stuff. I'm like, yeah, those people exist and they're probably always going to. Our level of concern should be gauged by how much institutional power they have. So, whatever they morph into, if it has a lot of institutional power, yeah, I'm concerned with that. But if it's just another, Mother Jones kind of thing, then yeah, I don't really care. But I'm fine. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. I don't want those people censored. They need to be able to spew their crazy, ideas on the internet so we can engage with them, thinking about like a On Liberty, John Stuart Mill kind of thing. But the last question you had about, is it actually the left or is it something else? And to the first one about, is it left versus right? I think you're dead on. I don't think it's left versus right. The way I wrote a piece before the election that I called, I think I said, what's at stake in this election? And I said, one of the lines I put in there is a long piece, is about why I was voting for Trump. And I said, this is not a left versus right issue. This is an establishment left versus everyone else issue. And so I talked about like Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, people that are on the left that the establishment clearly rejected and shit on. And so it's not left versus right. And there's also parts of the establishment right that are part of that. In my conversation with Bridget Fedesi, amazing thinker and so funny. She talked about how whenever she was in Washington, I forgot what it was for, why she was there. It might've been whenever she went out there for something with Shapiro, I think actually is what it was. Something about the election or something, I don't know. But she said it's when she realized that like all these people have this like performative, on the left and right, whether it's in Congress or something, have these like performative arguments. And then they go back and it's like, hey, are we still on for tennis or whatever bullshit that they do? And it's all just it's an act. She equated it to a play. Or I think she said that CNN is a play, or Twitter is like the understudies.
CNN is a play, and
the understudies or something.
Yeah, I commented on that. That was a great metaphor. Yeah,
that was fantastic. And so, but the problem is that the people watching, literally millions of people watching, don't know it's a play, don't know it's an act. So it's the equivalent of the kids who watch wrestling and don't know it's fake, and then they go out and they do this stuff, and one of them breaks the other one's neck because they don't know it. They don't know that this is some fake stuff. And so, yeah, no, the establishment, like the swamp is real. And that was one of the things that I think, I did a video maybe a month or so after the election in November called Calibrating Catharsis. And I said, one of the things I said, I think a lot of people were in a state of mourning, not necessarily for Trump specifically, but for what we lost and what is coming back. And that sound that we're hearing is all of the swamp creatures migrating, all the people who've made entire careers about being wrong on fucking everything. Why is John Kerry still employed? I'm going to get mad. All right. Anyway, the point is that these are the people, this is the swamp. These are the people who are career politicians, and they say what they need to say, and it's all hollow. They're vampiric bullshit. It's all hollow. And it's the establishment exists to preserve itself. The establishment doesn't persist or exist to preserve someone with a D in front of their name or an R in front of their name. It's just whoever is in that thing. And so, yeah, it's not left versus right. I think you are absolutely right, Clark, that if we keep it as left versus right thing, I mean, that's the thing where they're keeping us distracted. Like what you said, Kevin, it's like, look over here. And then Eric Weinstein calls it, he says, the idealism of every age is what's used to mask its theft. And I think it's exactly right. These motherfuckers are picking our pockets every single time, passing these things, passing infrastructure or whatever, so they can pass it on to their buddies. And so, yeah, no, it's not left versus right. Now, I think it's predominantly left, to be honest, right now. But here's the other thing I would add to that, and why I don't think that it's as simple as say it's predominantly left, because that kind of sounds like I'm letting the right off the hook. The people on the right, I almost every day, I just want to tweet out, the Republicans are not your savior. Republicans aren't going to save you. Because the right, the people in power on the right, so let's take a pie chart, don't understand their responsibility because they're the only thing that we have to fight this stuff. And so they're just sloughing their responsibility off. They don't understand or they don't care. And two, they're entrenched in the same stuff too. So look at someone like that Chris, Snoo, whatever that douchebag's name is in New Hampshire. I know Sununu, I know, but it's better to make fun of a shitty name. Who doesn't care about, I think they got the banning critical race theory stuff passed, and he's like, I'm not going to sign it. And then you have Mitch McConnell and even someone like Donald Trump, who he's not part of the establishment, but the Republicans are wanting him, to be a run for Senate. And you have this circle in the wagons in some of the corners around Liz Cheney. Now they did strip her of her stuff, but that was about the stuff with Trump, which, by the way, I agree that they should have done that. The fact that she voted to impeach him, it's like, no, get out of here, bitch. Like, I don't care. But the point is like, I hate Liz Cheney. I very rarely would call a woman a bitch, but I do not like Liz Cheney. I don't like those rhinos at all. And so, we call her an asshole. I don't care, but she's someone she's not operating in the best interest of her constituents. Let's put it that way. And so the problem is that the people on the right who actually have ability to do something aren't doing it. And they don't care about that responsibility they have. And so the left uses that term about complicity, right? And they're not wrong. Someone like Ibram Kendi using this idea of, if there's a bad thing happening and you don't say something, then you're complicit in it happening. That's true. You didn't come up with that. That's that if good men fail to act, evil prevails, jackass. Like, you just co-opted the idea and put your own bankrupt ideology into it, but it's not wrong. And so the establishment right is either complicit or actively involved in what the establishment left is doing in distracting us from all of their shit. That's the contempt. I just think that the establishment right doesn't air their contempt for normal people as much as the establishment left does. I mean, think about two things. Both of course are involving people on CNN. But was an Anderson Cooper who did the thing about people going back and eating at Olive Garden. And then it was Don Lemon who had that segment where they were joking about the Trump supporters, like, you can read. It's like, they have nothing but contempt for us. They don't care about us. I don't know if you've watched the stuff. So to go on a small, kind of aside, but the Brett Weinstein interviewed that doctor talking about ivermectin and how the big pharma basically has helped suppress, if this is right, if this drug really is effective against COVID, as this guy says, obviously I put the asterisk there, but he talks about, he's like, hey, remdesivir, $3,000 a treatment, a lot of money to be made selling remdesivir. Ivermectin's been off patent for a long time. No money to be made there. You know, they don't care. They don't care about us. They don't care about us. And so it's not left versus right. As long as we think about it that way, I'll end it here. One of the things I said a couple of months ago was I said, I'm going to try. There's this Rage Against the Machine song called Know Your Enemy. And I've been really trying to calibrate accordingly to knowing my enemy. Anyone who's trying to get me to hate someone else without any good reason or anything like that, that's my enemy. Someone who naturally just says, you know, I had a person talking to me about like, oh, it's, you know, bullying trans people whenever you say this thing the other day. That person is not my enemy. They're operating in good faith. I might not agree with them, but they're operating in good faith, not my enemy, right? The people who are trying to get us to hate each other, trying to convince me that that person's my enemy and vice versa, those are the actual people we need to be wary of and to get out of power. They don't deserve power. They don't deserve our respect. I totally agree with Michael Malice when he says they deserve contempt. This is something I've been slowly evolving on, but I think that we do have to be willing to get in the mud here a little bit. And so, yeah, it's not left versus right. It's establishment, that which is the establishment versus that which is not the establishment. And the last problem that I'll say is the establishment has been infiltrated by this crazy ass ideology that's become beholden to, and it thinks that it can keep feeding that tiger and it's not going to turn on them. You know, that's the example I give is it's the Third Reich and Hydra in the first Captain America movie. You know, it slowly grew and metastasized and used the power and the credibility and the resources until they were done with them. And then, you know, part of the end goal, spoiler alert, of Hydra, they were going to bomb Berlin. You know, they were bombing all the capitals. They're like, yeah, all of our enemies, like, we don't need you anymore. And so that establishment thing has become beholden to something that is way more dangerous that they think they can control, but they really can't. That was a bit of a rant there. So I'm gonna take a break and drink some whiskey, which will definitely make things better. But yeah, Clark, great thoughts and questions. If we do make it all about left versus right, you're right. We will lose because that's not the actual fight.
So I think there's a very, very telling. It's right at the beginning of The Road to Serfdom. F.A. Hayek addresses the book to.
I told you I'd shut you down if we went too much on Road to Serfdom stuff.
Well, I mean, the most telling part is just like address, and he even debated on whether changing this. I think the American version, they try to take that part out or something like that, but they're like, why would you address it that way? And he recognized in 43 that this is not a one-side thing. If you're just looking at the radical left, it's not just them.
The socialist of all parties.
Not even the radicals.
The socialist of all parties.
Yeah, socialist. Yeah. So socialist of all parties. But if you just focus on the one side and say the other side's, I mean, you're just creating that left versus right paradigm there. And, you know, to be able to recognize that, no, there are forces on both sides that are just colluding together. They have the same ideology, just claim one side or the other. That's what you need to be looking for. And, you know, that's what he addressed the book to be like, no, your ideas, although you think they're great because you're the ultimate planner, these are not going to work. We already have seen, and I know Clark B made a comment too, they haven't read history. I mean, we've kind of seen the playbook to what they're trying to do and how it progresses. And, you know, we just don't look at that danger. And as a part of the education, I mean, we talk about institutions, you know, I think the lack of education of understanding how these things progress and kind of the diversity viewpoint that's been lacking for a while is not allowing people to recognize the markers of you know, how this type of totalitarianism has progressed. And it's like letting it go free. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's a terrific observation by you, Clark.
Yeah.
Do you have any follow-ups after that one?
I don't. I would like to talk a little bit about some of these, you know, we don't have a whole lot of time left probably, but some of these things that there's just something I want to get into in terms of the psychology of the way people are thinking about this stuff. So I had those, I sent you those links in that document about how people were like where trust is. And there's just really strange to me cognitive dissonance in the way trust is operating right now. And how you see people talking about how the trust in media is at an all-time low, but also there's these reports about how the influence of media on our lives is at an all-time high. And then one of those other Pew Research things, it was, I want to get the exact numbers here. I wrote it down. 45% said little to no trust in Congress. That was 2021 data. 39% little to no trust in newspapers. That's also 2021 data. But at the same time, that Pew Research also had a thing where it was Americans see broad responsibilities for government. And so when you look at what they want, so as public trust in federal, this is a study from May 17, 2021 from Pew Research. As public trust in federal government remains low, Americans continue to say the federal government has a responsibility to provide support and services for all Americans in a number of forms. So you have like 87% clean air and water, 79% high quality K through 12 education, 64% say health insurance. You guys are assholes. I do not agree. 58% adequate income and retirement, 56% an adequate standard of living. Like, how is that the government's job? 43% said access to high speed internet, and 39% say a college education, which of course is crazy. But then you go over to another Pew Research poll from March 17th, so 14 days later, and you have 67% of Americans say that most politicians are corrupt. So you have them, this is the kind of dissonance I want to talk about, where it's like, I want the government to do all these things, but also you have damn near 2/3 of the population saying most politicians are corrupt. It's like, who do you think the government is? Like, it's not a computer sitting somewhere, it's the politicians. So most of them think they're corrupt, but they also wanted to do this stuff. So is that just like, do you think that's, I just honestly want to pick your brain on it, because I was looking at that before we got started. I'm like, this is blowing my mind. People are, I find more and more that I want to just channel my inner Ron Swanson, people are idiots, Leslie. And because that doesn't make any sense to me. There's so much distance there. Do you think that's, because I know that you also read Eric Hoffer's, The True Believer. You get all your good book recommendations from me. I'm gonna take some credit right there. But I know you also read that. Well, I also told you needed to read that one. Oh God, I was trying to think of what's that dipshit Adam Schiff wrote a book. Oh, no. We read that together. But no, didn't Adam Schiff write a book? Was it Adam Schiff, or was it
probably the lawyer from the ex-lawyer for Donald Trump? I forget his name. The guy's complete jackass, but he wrote a book. But this is the part. I think this actually goes right into what you're saying. The lawyer for Donald Trump, who ended up switching sides to write a book about how Donald Trump is so awful. People
worst guy ever.
Don't believe him when he's employed by Donald Trump, but do believe him when he's employed by CNN. Effectively, it's like,
right.
Exactly. Where is this going? Like, where do you understand?
So that's the question I have.
Exactly.
Is the dissonance where, because my point is, people who look at polls that talk about distrust in media, there was the one I sent you that Jamil Javani, that dude's a stud, by the way. He actually reminds me a lot of JP in terms of his just trying to help young men. But here's the Harris. I'll end here. Here's the Hill Harris X research poll from pretty recently, May 21st through 23rd, 2021. So the Pew stuff that I cited, and these are all taken in the same 2-week time span of May of this month. Maybe actually that Pew stuff was March. Actually, I need to look again. No, it was March. So sorry, all of these are within the last few months. Anyway, I've been drinking. So here it is. How much confidence do you have in each of the following institutions? Healthcare, 68%, a great deal or some, 32%, little to none. Local government is 65 to 35 in favor of. State government, 60 to 40 in favor of. Criminal justice system, 56 to 44 in favor of. Organized labor, 52 to 48 in favor of, and that's another way of saying unions, that's fucking anyway. Federal government.
How this is even on here,
right? Federal government, 48% have a great deal or some confidence in the federal government. 52% have little to no confidence in federal government. The media, 47% have a great deal or some confidence in the media. 53% have little to none. And so the thing that I've been thinking about is, and this is kind of the last thought I have on this stuff is, and again, I just wanted to pick your brain on it, is it seems to me that I think one of the other links I sent you is where people were talking about how the media is a growing influence, even though their trust is waning, right? Trust in the media is waning, but their influence is growing. Trust in the federal government
and the problem
is falling, but the people want them to do all these things. So it's like, is it that people are just becoming so selective in how they think about this stuff? You know, where when someone says, well, trust in media is falling, it's like, do you think that those people are reading no media? Like, are they, or is it they don't trust anything but the Young Turks or, you know, NBC, even someone like, so my dad is on the left, like pretty far on the left. And he doesn't know, he's insufferable in these conversations. I love my dad to death, but he's just awful to talk to because he's someone who still thinks like NPR is an independent entity, totally unbiased. The New York Times is an independent entity, totally unbiased. Washington Post, independent entity, totally unbiased. And it's like, I just, you know, and so is it, but he also will say that CNN has become the same as MSNBC. And so, you know, I've heard him say, I try to get stuff from a variety of sources. And so he'll go, I like to look at NPR, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And I'm like, you're maybe looking at 4.5 to 0.5 independent, you know, in terms of getting different opinions there. But my point is that he also has recognized that CNN has become insufferable. And so I think that it seems to me that there's this weird thing where people are identifying like some of these news agencies are compromised, and so they don't trust them. So they might say my trust has fallen because I used to trust CNN, but I don't. But the trust for somewhere like the New York Times or NPR has maybe remained the same or grown because they're like, man, thank God that the NPR has remained unbiased through all this. You know what I mean? And so whether it's that or the thing with the government, I just don't know what to make of that. And really, I'm just more looking for like, what do you think about that? But it's just, it kind of blows my mind a little bit.
There are a decent amount of people on the right, and on the right, I'm talking about the more Trump supporting sect who believe that Fox News is no longer a reliable source. Right. So there is a problem in which,
and then they go to Newsmax or something like that, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. And so if someone like your father would be looking at CNN, they said one nice thing about Trump, or they didn't go hard in enough on Trump as NPR does, or a lot of these other outlets do, is that the New York Times does, which I think the New York Times is much more crazy than CNN most of the time, depending on who's writing for them. There might be a problem of you slipped on your messaging one little bit, and now I don't trust you at all because there are all these other outlets out there. So I think that could be a problem of, you know, I didn't find Fox News was conservative enough, so now I'm going to drop them for now, and I'm going to stick with Newsmax and OAN and all those other sources. So I do think there's a problem, and I think that's something that CNN and Fox News are very conscious of, and the reason why their messaging is starting to really go in lockstep. So that could be part of the phenomenon, but I am baffled in general by the idea of, I don't trust our politicians, but let's give them more power. And I think the disconnect there is the not understanding that you're giving them power, right? You know, I know Bernie fans who are like, we just need to do democratic socialism, and they have this democratic part as a stand-in for just everything good, and the politicians are outside. They don't understand the democratic part, or they don't even understand why the founders feared democracy in general. Yep. They don't understand this mob rule aspect of it.
Nor do they care to understand it.
I think oh yeah, absolutely. But that is how you get people who are arguing against themselves in the same breath. I mean, social media is full of those types of people that again, the Bernie bros who will go all out against, you know, privatized corporations, because they're evil, but you know, politicians can't possibly be evil because we can vote them in, or it's some form of democracy. And that's even the few Marxists that are left should shouldn't say few, the growing number of Marxists that are left, they say the same thing, that we need to democratize private industry, because this democracy
Neo-Marxist
label is just labeled for everything that's good.
Not a lot of old school Marxists, but there's a lot of neo-Marxists. Yeah.
I mean, I've listened to a lot of videos of people who are genuine Marxists, and they believe Marxism is an answer to capitalism. That's the only reason it exists, and it's always going to exist if capitalism is there, right? So, but they just believe in this democracy style, that the group, the collective, should be able to dictate what everyone does, and they don't understand the tyranny aspect of it, and that totalitarianism is required to do that. You need a stronger force, you need a bigger gun to have this industry do what you want, and they don't understand. They don't understand that that's totalitarianism. They think that's just the will of the people, right? So it's again a breakdown of the institution of education that is kind of not allowing them to see this for what it is, and making them think that utopia is just one step away if they could vote in the right guy and institute the right plan.
All right. So I think that kind of wraps up our questions and stuff. We should probably wrap it up. We're getting at about 2 hours since we started around on Thinkspot and YouTube. What do you think is a good way to kind of close this particular topic out? And by the way, first off, thank everyone for your patience, everyone who's here, for your patience, and for watching, and for contributing questions. And even if you didn't contribute questions, just being here and participating. This stuff is important. And so, and if you're here, you understand that. So just want to say thank you, and to Thinkspot as well for promoting this and doing this event, and working hard to make sure that we got the stream functioning. So just wanted to give, before we wrap up, I didn't want to forget to give a good shout out to the people who made this happen on Thinkspot's end, and then also the people who watched and asked questions and stuff. And so just really appreciate you guys, seriously. That's the fact that people there, there's even just a handful of people that seem to actually give a shit about this stuff is one of the things that keeps me going. Today's my daughter's 2nd birthday, and I was watching her play in the park earlier today. She has this little stuffed owl that I got her, and she loves owls, and she'll be like, owl, hoo-hoo, and this is the cutest thing ever. It melts your heart. But the reason why we fight is because it's like, what do we want the world to look like, whenever she is my age, and so I just really appreciate you guys' support, and for being here and being part of this fight with us and this conversation with us. So that was, sorry, I didn't mean to get off on that tangent, but I want to say it before I forgot. But Kevin, what's a way that you think we could kind of tie this off a little bit for the folks at home? Explain it to the folks at home. What is 9/11? Did you watch that? Have you seen that Norm video?
What is love?
What is Norm? The Norm video where he said, "Explain it for the folks at home." Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, go.
Yeah. Sorry, we went on a Norm Macdonald kick a while ago, and Norm Macdonald and was it Ken M?
Yep.
So funny. A few days ago. So yeah, if you didn't understand some of the references made during this, we're sorry, but look them up on YouTube. Oh, yeah. I mean, the way to end this is really, I think people, the responses I got when posting this as a promotion was, what do we do? I mean, we're trying to build actionable items here. What do we do with these specific institutions? Is it time to leave them? Is it time to build sandbags and really hunker down and trying to revivify, or to make sure these institutions do what they originally were meant to do? And that's really the hard question. And there's so much nuance there. You can't just say in education, all right, it's time to siege, it's time to separate. You can't just say that wholesale. It's too difficult to do that. I mean, I think there are some institutions you can do that. Military is an example of one. That, it's a pretty clear line in the sand, but a lot of these, it's very difficult to do. So really, how do you do it in your own personal capacity? To be able to fight back against these bad ideas in a world that does not allow you to do so. There are some institutions like media that seem to be the main battlefield right now. Like I would say this is the easiest battlefield to analyze in media, where you have CNN fighting Fox News, and you have the Young Turks fighting the Daily Wire, Louder with Crowder, all these different smaller channels of information is really helping us I mean, if you're able to read the information properly and understand, all right, here are the facts, here is the opinion. Now I know, what the actual story is. It takes a lot of work on your end. So I guess the real message here is if you know, or if you want to know whether you should siege or separate, you have to, invest a good amount of time into what you think is important. I think it's another good message here is you only have limited bandwidth and you have to focus in on what do you think is the load bearing institution to you? What do you think is going to affect you personally? What do you think is going to affect your family, right? The calculus, the math changes once you have a family, right? So I don't know how much I would care about education because I'm done with that stuff, right? I got my degree, I got my credential, I'm out now. But when you have kids, they go back into that system. Now that math changes for you. Now that question's not as easy. When you want to fight back, it's harder to say, yes, I'm going to fight back when you have a child at stake. When you push back against the public education system, when your child's in that system and you're like, all right, now I got to figure out what's worth me pushing back when my child can be affected in the situation. I want them to be ostracized by other kids or the educators and stuff like that. So, your focus is going to change throughout your life, but it really comes down to you understanding where is my time most useful when fighting against some of these institutions. And that is where you figure out, is it time to hunker down, or is it time to just say, all right, this institution is clearly dying, it's time for me to get away from it, and there's another valid alternative, or it's up to you to make a valid alternative. So that's the hardest question to ask and the actionable item.
And it's going to be different for different people, and it's going to require a lot of discernment and a lot of creativity. There's this, I've talked about this in a video I made like a year and a half ago. So in other words, no one watching this will actually have heard me talk about it. But are you familiar with, I'm not like some big history buff, but I remember the things that I think are interesting. Do you know the Battle of Alesia? There's a battle, Julius Caesar in the
Lord of the Rings?
Gaelic Wars. That's right. Yeah, no, it's when Dumbledore is trying to get the ring to Mordor. So it's one of Julius Caesar's like greatest victories. So the Gauls, which is basically like modern day like France and I think some other country over there, had this like big revolt, and Caesar was going to siege this Alesia, which was held by a larger army, the Gallic army, and the leader, I think his name was Vercingetorix, I believe. People can fact check me on that. But the point for a theme is, so he knows that there's reinforcements coming. Okay. So Caesar gets there. He has his Roman army. They have cavalry, which the Gauls don't have near as much of. But he's wildly outnumbered, right? And the Alesia was on a hill. So he doesn't have the terrain. He doesn't have the numbers, right? He probably doesn't have the supplies to try and siege them. So let's go with our siege and separate things when we think about it. And he knows that reinforcements are coming. So what he does is he creates a third option. And within a very short time span, I believe less than 2 weeks, his soldiers clear out a lot of timber from the outlying area. And he builds a fortress around Alesia. And so it's basically a ring where it's got an interior wall, and it's just two walls, okay? An interior wall, exterior wall. So he has a way of defending against the reinforcements that come, but also defending against anyone that comes down, any of the Gauls that come down from Alesia. And I don't think it lasted very long once the reinforcements got there. I want to say it was less than a week. It might have been 4 days. I could be wrong. My point is he laid siege in a way that he picked a third option. He found an option that other people wouldn't have seen. That's actually where he met, where Mark Antony became one of his like lieutenants or whatever he was, where there was like, because there was multiple days where their scouts are able to get out. And so like the people inside were able to coordinate with people outside. And so they try to do a pincer move on one side of the wall and they're able to push them back. And it's a crazy story of the battle and how it happened because they did not have the numbers. But they won anyway, is my point. And so they were laying siege to something. They had inferior numbers. They didn't have the tactical advantage. They didn't have the institution, so to speak, right? They didn't have the terrain. Nothing was in their favor except for their wits. And that's one of the things that made Julius Caesar such a genius, is that he saw options where other people didn't. And so we have to be creative. We have to look and see what are the ways in, what are the ways to win these fights that maybe aren't rooted in history. Caesar didn't look and say, well, what did other people do, and look for the precedent or something like that. He just thought, what's the thing that I can do here now? He wasn't looking to someone else. And so we have to get creative and understand that the stuff in the past are stuff we can learn from for sure. But when it comes to trying to take back some of these institutions, it's going to be basically down to our will, real will. Like, what is your freaking will to survive in this way? And our own creativity. And finding that third option, that maybe in some cases it isn't just a matter of stacking sandbags or building an ark, but maybe there's this third option that we don't know about yet. I don't know. But that's how we win. Gladwell wrote a whole book about it called David and Goliath, about how people with inferior numbers and didn't have institutional support were able to win everything from basketball to, I don't even know what else he talks about. I think he might have cited the civil rights movement in there. I mean, that's one example in my mind that I think we probably should draw a lot of lessons from. But anyway, we can do it, is my point, is that we can do it. We just have to get creative, and we can't lose heart, and we have to match their intensity and exceed their dedication and their creativity. They're not actually that creative. They have one thing: you're a racist, give me power. I'm better than you. I should have power. I should have the megaphone. That's it. So it's not that hard to exceed the creativity required to say something as simplistic and dumb as that. But we have to match or exceed their intensity and dedication and all of those things. And like Caesar did at the Battle of Alesia, which you can look it up. I mean, it's a fascinating battle. That's one of the things I love. That's why I remember it, is because it's like this guy who shouldn't have won, but he built a damn fortress around, so he had 2 sieges going on. I mean, it's just crazy. I think we have to think like that. We have to think outside the box, but I think we can do it. It's just a matter of doing it, and I don't mean that as like some dismissive thing, but I mean that quite literally. It's just a matter of actually doing it. So anyway, all right. Kevin, do you have anything else to add before we kind of close it out here?
I mean, no, you kind of all said it there, that don't sit down and take it, because that's what got us here. Mm-hmm. I think it's one huge message that we can't, I always say that conservatives and libertarians tend to hold up in their house with their guns and think that the outside world is going to stay outside the door. Well, if you have internet, the world is now inside your house.
It's already there. Yep, the fight's here.
You're not going to have. And just like we've all been taken back by the Blue's Clues episode of, drag queen story hour getting brought to your kids' television via Nick Jr.
The BLM
sit here and wait,
microphone.
it's going to come for you no matter what.
Yeah.
So, it's, you pick your battle. Siege and separation, yes, I hope there's a third option, but there is no option to sit there and take it.
That's
not a viable option. That's not a third option that you can take. It's not an avenue you can take. So, and that's been the, speaking as the token conservative here, I would say that's the avenue we've taken for a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's time to actually speak up and say what you mean. So, but yeah, I mean, it was a great conversation here. I want to make sure that you can find us both on Thinkspot. You can go to search Return to Reason on Thinkspot, search engineering politics on Thinkspot. Find us on Twitter at My Mundane Mind for Truman. You can find me at ENG_politics on Twitter as well. We're both on YouTube. Search us there. We both have communities on Locals. So you can go to returntoreason.locals.com or to engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can also support us there or at Thinkspot. So, there's a lot of places you can find us, and hopefully, you listen to more of our our conversations, and, we can try to figure this out together. I think what the part that I enjoy most with Truman, and I think this is also, what gravitates people towards Jordan Peterson, is he thinks out loud. You can tell he's not just giving a prepared response. He's kind of, looking around, trying to find the answer in live time. And I think that type of genuine response really helps pull people in and being like, all right, this is a guy who's actually trying to think rather than just having prepared talking points. And the reason I like talking to you is so often we kind of have this rough outline of what we're about to do, and then immediately we scrap it. As soon as live goes up, we're both like, all right, out the window. Let's have a weird conversation that we're unprepared for, and see how we can think through this in live time. And really, I think that's what places like Thinkspot are about, is to think through this stuff genuinely rather than just having prepared talking points. And so I think that's why it's a great conversation.
Yep. I have nothing to add to that. I appreciate that. I'd love talking to you. The only thing, actually, I do have something to add to that. The only thing I would say is people do need to check out stuff that we've done before, and check out our Thinkspots and our locals and everywhere else, Medium, whatever. And we're going to be doing a book series on Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, and I think we're going to record the first one, like I said earlier, this weekend, about the introduction, because the introduction to the definitive edition is seriously like about a fifth of the book, but there's a lot there.
A good third, yeah.
And then going back through it, I tell people that, and this is so true, that The Road to Serfdom was one of the most influential books that I've ever read whenever I was first starting to sort through this stuff around maybe 2017 and getting into the real nuts and bolts of it. That was a book that whenever I finished it, I was literally calling people. I was painting at the time. I was working a summer job painting. And so I was on, ladders, just calling people and trying to talk to them while I was painting. I mean, so I'm dead serious. And just because I wanted to talk about the book and talk about how much that opened my mind to what was going on in society. And so that's a book that we're hoping to try and share with people who haven't been exposed to those ideas. So at least be looking for that, whenever we post the first conversation. We're going to do we're going to go through the whole thing. So it's the best parts of a book club, right? You don't have to actually read it. You can just, listen to us talk about it and give you the bullet points. So be sure to check that. But other than that, I agree with everything you said, Kevin. I love these conversations. I was so excited about this. The credentialing thing has been something that's just been eating at my brain, and I don't know what to do with it. And I'm not sure there's a good answer for it. But either way, I love this. And I'm very thankful to the people who participated and asked questions and were patient, with the questions being answered, and with the Thinkspot team who, worked tirelessly to make sure that we got the live stream on. It was a little bit late, but they were working. They didn't say screw it. So anyway, and yeah, you know where to find us. Thinkspot Locals, Twitter. We'll put all that stuff in the description of this as well once it's posted. So I think that's it, Kevin. Is there anything else you want to say before I hit end? Before we stop being live? No?
That was perfect.
Perfect. Okay. All right. I'm gonna end our conversation there. Thank you, everyone, again. And we will see you next time. Peace.
All right, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that, because I know I did. Now, this is normally the part where I tell you where to find us, but now I've begun to realize that at the end of most of these live or recorded conversations that I have with other creators, we tell you where to find us at the end. So I don't know why I repeat it here. So for those of you watching the video version, just pause now to see where you can find Truman, and then pause now to see where you can find me. And there you have it. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.